I spent years inside the intelligence system watching the line between analysis and politics blur, but what unfolded when Donald Trump publicly threatened Iran over internal unrest marked something more corrosive. This was not intelligence driven deterrence, it was narrative signaling masquerading as strategy. When a U.S. president declares the military locked and loaded in response to protests inside a sovereign state, that message is not filtered through the national intelligence estimate process, not vetted against capability assessments, and not grounded in a clear understanding of adversary decision making. It is theater. Intelligence professionals are trained to ask basic questions before drawing conclusions. Who benefits? What capabilities exist? What red lines are real? And what second order effects follow? None of that discipline was visible here. Iran's leadership did not hear a calibrated warning. They heard confirmation of something they have believed since 1953 when the CIA helped overthrow Mohammad Mossadegh, that the United States uses internal pressure as a pretext for coercion, that historical memory matters. Intelligence failures are often born not from missing data, but from ignoring how adversaries interpret our actions. Trump's warning assumed that Iran's leadership would see American force posture as a stabilizing deterrent. In reality, Iran's security apparatus is built to absorb threats, suppress unrest, and externalize pressure. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has decades of experience managing sanctions, covert attacks, and information warfare. Public threats do not fracture that system, they consolidate it. By framing unrest as an opening for U.S. intervention, Washington handed Tehran a counter narrative that justified repression and regional escalation. Strategically, this was self defeating. Intelligence assessments for years have shown that Iran responds to overt threats by activating proxies, hardening facilities, and accelerating asymmetric responses. Yet the political narrative ignored those findings. The result was predictable. Iranian officials warned that American interference would trigger regional chaos, not because they were bluffing, but because they possessed the means to do exactly that through allies in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. The hard lesson here is simple and uncomfortable. Intelligence is supposed to constrain impulsive policy by grounding decisions in reality. When leaders bypass that discipline and substitute spectacle for analysis, they do not project strength. They expose confusion. This is where strategic narratives begin to collapse, not on the battlefield, but at the moment intelligence stops informing power and starts serving it. When I listen to Iranian officials respond to American threats, I don't hear improvisation or panic. I hear institutional memory speaking. One of the most persistent intelligence failures in Washington is the assumption that Iran reacts emotionally to pressure. That assumption is wrong. Iran reacts historically. Its senior security leadership is steeped in a long record of U.S. behavior that shapes how every warning, sanction, or military signal is interpreted. From their perspective, American threats are not isolated events. They are part of a continuous pattern stretching back to the CIA-backed coup in 1953, the arming of Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War, decades of sanctions, cyber operations like Stuxnet, and targeted killings such as Qasem Soleimani. Intelligence analysis that ignores that accumulated experience is not analysis at all. When President Trump publicly warned Iran over internal protests, Iranian decision makers did not debate whether Washington might intervene out of humanitarian concern. They assessed whether the United States was once again using unrest as leverage to weaken the regime. That assessment is grounded in precedent, not paranoia. Declassified U.S. Documents confirm that Washington has repeatedly explored exploiting internal dissent in Iran, from covert broadcasting to sanctions designed to induce economic pain. Iranian intelligence services are built around countering exactly that playbook. They are not surprised by it, and they are not intimidated by rhetoric. Instead, they interpret public threats as confirmation that compromise invites pressure, not relief. That logic explains why Iran's response emphasized regional consequences and American vulnerability. Tehran's leadership understands asymmetry better than most U.S. policymakers. They cannot defeat the United States conventionally, but they can raise costs incrementally through proxies, maritime disruption, and political influence in neighboring states. Intelligence reporting for years has documented this approach, yet it is routinely dismissed in public discourse as bluffing. It is not bluffing, it is doctrine. When Iran warns that interference will lead to chaos across the region, they are signaling capability, not intent alone. They are reminding Washington that escalation does not occur on American terms. The strategic consequence of ignoring Iran's memory is that U.S. threats lose credibility while Iranian counter threats gain it. Every time Washington signals force without a coherent follow through strategy, Tehran learns that American red lines are rhetorical tools, not operational commitments. That lesson hardens Iranian positions and narrows diplomatic space. The hard lesson for intelligence professionals is that adversaries remember what we prefer to forget. Strategic behavior is cumulative. When policymakers treat each crisis as isolated, they guarantee miscalculation. Iran's response to Trump was chilling, not because it was extreme, but because it was consistent, measured, and rooted in a history Washington refuses to fully acknowledge. One of the most damaging pathologies I witnessed during my time in government was not the absence of intelligence, but the quiet manipulation of it. By the time policy debates about Iran reach the White House or cable news, the intelligence has often already been bent to fit a preferred storyline. Analysts learn quickly which judgments are welcomed and which ones stall careers. With Iran, this distortion became chronic. Intelligence that emphasized regime resilience, social control mechanisms, and adaptive economic survival under sanctions was routinely downplayed. Instead, selective fragments were elevated to support the narrative of imminent collapse or popular uprising. That is not how intelligence is supposed to work. Sound analysis begins with capabilities and constraints, not wishful outcomes. Yet when protests erupted in Iran, the intelligence conversation in Washington shifted almost instantly from assessment to opportunity. Internal unrest was framed less as a domestic Iranian issue and more as leverage. That framing shaped how reporting was filtered and interpreted. Signals of regime cohesion were labeled propaganda, reports of protest fatigue or security force loyalty were minimized. What mattered was sustaining the message that pressure was working. This is how intelligence becomes fiction. It is not fabricated outright, it is curated. I have seen this process up close. Raw reporting remains available, but finished assessments subtly adjust language, confidence levels, and emphasis. Probabilities become possibilities. Possibilities become policy justifications. Over time, decision makers stop asking what is true and start asking what supports the line. In the Iran case, this produced a dangerous feedback loop. Public threats were issued based on optimistic assumptions about regime fragility, while intelligence that contradicted those assumptions was sidelined. Iranian leaders, watching this unfold, drew their own conclusions. They saw not a confident superpower guided by disciplined analysis, but a political system talking itself into escalation. Strategically, this matters because adversaries test what they perceive. When intelligence is politicized, policy becomes predictable, and predictability invites exploitation. Iran's response to Trump reflected that understanding. They did not overreact. They calibrated their message to highlight American exposure and regional vulnerability, knowing that Washington's narrative required constant reinforcement. The consequence is a shrinking margin for error. Once intelligence is subordinated to messaging, leaders lose the ability to recognize when assumptions are wrong. That is how wars start unintentionally. The hard lesson here is institutional, not partisan. Intelligence agencies exist to tell leaders uncomfortable truths, not to validate slogans. When that function collapses, strategic judgment collapses with it. Iran did not need to outthink Washington. It only needed to wait for Washington to stop thinking critically itself. Deterrence, when it works, is quiet. It does not rely on social media posts. press conferences, or rhetorical escalation. It rests on a shared understanding between adversaries of capabilities, thresholds, and consequences. What I saw in the confrontation between the Trump administration and Iran was not deterrence in its classical sense, but deterrence theater. Public warnings and maximalist language were used as substitutes for disciplined signaling. Uh, Intelligence professionals know the difference instinctively. Theater is designed for domestic consumption. Deterrence is designed for adversaries. Iran understood this distinction immediately. When Washington declared itself locked and loaded, Tehran did not scramble its forces or evacuate leadership. It issued a measured response that emphasized regional consequences and American exposure. That was not bravado. It was an intelligence-based reminder that deterrence is reciprocal. U.S. Policymakers often speak as if deterrence is something America imposes unilaterally. That is a conceptual error. Deterrence exists only when both sides believe escalation will impose unacceptable costs. Iran has spent decades building exactly that capability. Through proxy forces, missile programs, maritime harassment, and political influence across the Middle East, Iran has constructed a web of leverage that complicates any U.S. military response. Intelligence assessments have documented this reality repeatedly, yet public discourse reduces deterrence to bomber deployments and carrier strike groups as if visibility equals effectiveness. It does not. Iran's deterrent posture is intentionally opaque. Its strength lies in ambiguity, not spectacle. By contrast, American signaling has become increasingly performative. Red lines are drawn publicly, then quietly adjusted. Threats are issued without clear objectives or exit strategies. From an intelligence perspective, this erodes credibility. Adversaries begin to test limits incrementally, confident that Washington will respond rhetorically before it responds operationally. Iran's response to Trump reflected that calculation. They did not challenge U.S. forces directly. They warned of cascading instability, knowing that the United States is risk-averse when escalation pathways are unclear. The strategic consequence is a mismatch between perceived and actual power. American leaders believe they are restoring deterrence through visibility and pressure. Iranian leaders believe they are absorbing that pressure while expanding their strategic depth. Both cannot be right. Intelligence suggests Iran's interpretation is closer to reality. The hard lesson here is that deterrence cannot be performed. It must be embedded in coherent strategy, credible commitments, and a willingness to accept costs. When deterrence becomes a talking point rather than an operational framework, it invites miscalculation. Iran's message was chilling precisely because it revealed how little American signaling now constrains adversary behavior. What Washington consistently underestimates is how quickly narrative-driven policy bleeds into regional instability. When U.S. leaders frame complex intelligence environments through moralized slogans and public threats, allies and adversaries alike are forced to adjust in real time. I watched this dynamic unfold repeatedly, and Iran was only one node in a much larger system. When the United States escalates rhetorically toward Tehran, every actor in the Middle East recalculates risk. Iraqi militias hedge their alignment. Gulf states quietly de-risk exposure. Israel accelerates contingency planning. None of this shows up in presidential statements, but it shows up clearly in intelligence reporting. Narrative warfare has consequences that cannot be reversed by clarification later. Once threats are issued publicly, backing down becomes politically costly, even when intelligence suggests restraint is wiser. Iran understands this trap well. Its response to Trump was calibrated not just for Washington, but for the region. By warning of chaos and damage to American interests, Tehran was signaling to neighbors that U.S. actions invite instability. That message resonates because history supports it. From Iraq to Syria to Libya, intelligence records show that U.S. interventions justified by simplified narratives often produce power vacuums and prolonged disorder. Regional actors remember that pattern, even when Washington prefers to forget it. The strategic consequence is erosion of informal cooperation. States that quietly share intelligence or provide logistical access begin to question whether U.S. leadership is predictable. They diversify partnerships, hedge commitments, and open channels to rivals. This is not ideological drift, it is risk management. Intelligence professionals track these shifts closely, but they are rarely reflected in public messaging. Narrative warfare compresses complexity into binaries: strength versus weakness, resolve versus appeasement. Real intelligence operates in gradients. When policy ignores those gradients, it pushes regional actors towards self-help strategies that reduce U.S. influence over time. Iran benefits from this environment because it thrives in fragmentation. Its regional strategy is not to dominate openly, but to entangle. The more chaotic the strategic landscape becomes, the more leverage Tehran gains relative to a United States constrained by alliances and domestic politics. The hard lesson here is structural. Power is not only measured in military assets, but in the ability to shape stable expectations. Narrative warfare undermines that ability by prioritizing domestic signaling over external coherence. Iran's chilling message was not a threat of immediate violence. It was a warning that America's way of talking about power is steadily eroding its ability to manage it. By the time Iran responded to Trump's threat, the deeper damage had already been done. The erosion of American credibility did not begin with that exchange, and it will not end with it. What made the moment significant was how clearly it illustrated a structural shift that intelligence professionals have been warning about for years. The United States is no longer operating in a unipolar environment where its narratives automatically define reality. Power is now distributed across multiple centers, and credibility is adjudicated externally, not declared internally. In that environment, repeated intelligence distortions accumulate quickly. Allies, competitors, and neutral states compare American claims against outcomes. When they diverge consistently, trust decays. I saw this firsthand as foreign intelligence counterparts became increasingly skeptical of U.S. assessments, not because they lacked information, but because they doubted Washington's willingness to confront inconvenient facts. With Iran, this credibility gap is especially pronounced. For years, U.S. officials have alternated between portraying Iran as on the brink of collapse and as an existential regional menace. Both cannot be simultaneously true. Intelligence agencies understand this contradiction, but political narratives often ignore it. The result is analytical incoherence that foreign observers notice immediately. When Trump threatened intervention over protests, Iran's response was not just directed at Washington, it was aimed at a global audience already primed to question American consistency. In a multipolar world, credibility is relational. Russia, China, and regional powers watch how the United States frames intelligence and how often those frames shift. They adjust their own messaging accordingly, often positioning themselves as defenders of sovereignty against American interference. Whether or not that framing is sincere is irrelevant. It works because it exploits visible U.S. contradictions. Intelligence reporting has documented this trend across multiple theaters, from Ukraine to the Middle East. When intelligence becomes a tool of narrative maintenance, its persuasive power collapses abroad. The strategic consequence follows quickly. Diplomatic leverage shrinks. Sanctions lose impact as alternatives emerge. Military threats require greater escalation to achieve the same effect. Iran's ability to resist pressure is not solely a function of its own strength. It is a reflection of declining confidence in American judgment. The hard lesson here is uncomfortable for those who equate power with dominance. In a multipolar system, credibility is capital. It is accumulated slowly and spent quickly. Once intelligence is perceived as politicized, rebuilding that capital becomes exponentially harder. Iran's chilling message was less about defiance than diagnosis. They were describing a world in which American narratives no longer command automatic belief. An intelligence stripped of discipline cannot compensate for that loss. The final failure here is not tactical. and it is not tied to any single administration. It is institutional. Intelligence exists to discipline power, not to decorate it. When I look at how the United States now talks about Iran, I see a system that has forgotten why intelligence analysis was separated from policy advocacy in the first place. That separation was not bureaucratic trivia, it was a safeguard against self-deception. Once intelligence becomes an accessory to narrative, leaders lose the ability to recognize limits, and states lose the ability to avoid unnecessary conflict. The exchange between Trump and Iran was only a symptom of that deeper breakdown. American leaders issued threats without clearly defined objectives, timelines, or thresholds, assuming that resolve alone would substitute for strategy. Iran responded not with panic, but with a sober assessment of leverage, memory, and asymmetry. That contrast should be unsettling. Intelligence professionals are trained to think in terms of second and third order effects. What happens after the threat is issued? What happens if the adversary does not comply? What happens when credibility is tested repeatedly without decisive follow-through? Those questions were largely absent from public discourse, and that absence is itself a warning sign. The hard lesson intelligence forgot is that adversaries do not experience our narratives the way we do. They do not consume them emotionally or morally. They dissect them operationally. Iran's response reflected an understanding that American strategic culture has drifted toward performative dominance rather than disciplined statecraft. That drift makes the United States louder but less persuasive. It makes escalation easier to initiate and harder to control. Over time, it hollows out deterrence and replaces it with bluff management. The collapse of the American strategic narrative is not about declining military capacity. It is about declining analytical rigor. When intelligence assessments are bent to sustain political confidence, leaders become prisoners of their own messaging. They escalate to avoid embarrassment rather than to achieve outcomes. That is how credibility dies quietly. Iran's message was chilling because it exposed this reality without theatrics. They were not daring the United States to act. They were demonstrating that they understand American constraints better than American leaders seem to. The damage speaks for itself. Once intelligence becomes fiction, power loses its anchor in reality, and strategy becomes guesswork dressed up as resolve. That is the point at which decline stops being a theory and starts becoming a condition.